Oh, hello. It feels like it has been approximately 1,000 years, though it's been closer to about 2 weeks because I went and traipsed around Tokyo for a couple of weeks and then came back and was slapped in the face with jet lag. And while I had really grand intentions of getting a bunch of videos ready and queued for everyone while I was away, that didn't happen. So hopefully a lot of those videos that I had in the works before I left will be coming to you shortly, and one of them at least we may talk about more organically in the course of today's discussion, which is just a September wrap-up of what I read in September, which was a little less, though also a little more in some ways because it has been a very odd reading year for me. And September reading was a little complicated by time zones in that one book I finished in Tokyo, it was October 1st. Here it would have been September 30th, but I'm going to honor the time in which it was completed and count it toward October. And I did get less of a kind of final September push than I anticipated because I really was excited to do a lot of reading on that 12-hour plus flight to Tokyo, but I didn't get the reading I expected done on the way there. On the way back, yes. On the way there, no. So let's go ahead and dive into what I did read in September because I still read a lot of things that we absolutely should talk about. Starting with Saint-Seducing Gold by Brittany N. Williams. This is the sequel to that self-same metal that came out last year and we did a dedicated feature Friday on. And this is a young adult series that is taking place in Elizabethan England and has a touch of the fantastical and a touch of the fae within this world. And the fae are definitely present in this book in that we have Joan, our lead, kind of facing off against Titania, who has taken over the body of the queen and decided that she wants Joan as one of her ladies in waiting, which causes all kinds of uproar in the court, especially with the spy master, William Cecil, who then is an enemy for Joan because he expected that ladies in waiting position to go to his daughter. Additionally, he is just generally bigoted in the fact that we have Joan, who is a black woman or a black young lady in Elizabethan England. And so that adds a whole nother dynamic to the picture that is grappled with in this book. But then in addition to Cecil, we have his son who had a slight appearance in the first book and Joan saved him from the fae, and he gets a crush essentially on Joan because of this and acts on that crush in the worst possible way by attempting to blackmail her into a courtship or specifically into a marriage is the end goal he hopes for, which further complicates Joan's ongoing romantic interests from the first book, in addition to her, again, facing off against the Queen of the Fairies and attempting to reinstate this pact that has been upset and worried about her godfather. There are a whole lot of pieces in play. And so because of Joan's kind of moving to the court this book, we spend less time with Shakespeare and the Shakespearean company, though we still do get to revel in that because I think that that is one of the joys of this book and this series, especially as Shakespeare is such an active character. And I talked about in the first book how I think it's really evident that Williams is an actor or is trained in Shakespeare, has that theater background in the way that we see Shakespeare characterized here, in the way that we see the company especially characterized here, the kind of filial nature of it, the camaraderie. It's just really great to see. And then of course we do have these wonderful fantastical elements, and it is a really unique take on the fae because it's playing in that realm of more powerful and dangerous and scary that I think has really risen to prevalence in literature within the last couple decades. And I say that kind of broadly because obviously this interpretation has roots in the folklore and is a kind of return to the origins of the folklore. But like in A Midsummer Night's Dream, we have this kind of butting of heads with that all-powerful kind of interpretation with the more kind of whimsical and beautiful interpretations of the fae and how fairies are more kind of popularized. And so we have that at the heart of this series, and it makes a kind of interesting tonal duality as well, especially in this series that is young adult and has these kind of deeper themes at play and kind of more adult considerations in terms of the relationships, in the sense that it's not young YA, but at the same time, it reads very easily and almost deceptively in that. And I'm not saying that I don't think it's appropriate completely for young YA, but there is a lot more romance than someone at that end of the spectrum may be interested in. I don't know. It's been a long time since I was at that side of the spectrum. And additionally, in terms of that romance, while it's there, some of it does feel a little underdeveloped, I'm not going to lie, but at the same time, I just had such a good time with this book, and the first book for sure, that I didn't care as much. Like, I could recognize that, but at the same time, it was so action forward that it kept me going. And so it's very interesting in how it positions within the young adult market in that, I think, in terms of it feeling a little looser in some places, but still having that energy. And just where within the spectrum of YA I would place it, I don't really know. All I know is that I am having a great time with this world. I love worlds where I get to kind of like just run around the streets of Elizabethan England. And here again, we did, like I said, focus more on the court side of things, so we got to explore that realm a little bit more. I don't know which realm I prefer though, because I really, really liked the world that we explored in the first book, like Joan's family unit and her home, which we do still get to spend time in here and with her parents, but especially the Shakespeare of it all and getting to spend time with the company and the king's men more specifically. So I think it's a really fun balance. I will be interested to see where the focus shifts for the third book, especially because there was a development in this book in terms of like kind of pushing it, I would argue, toward the like higher end of young adult, because there was a character, something happened to a character that I didn't believe was going to happen to a character. And to be fair, this is a world with magic, so it may not be the be-all end-all for that character. And also, to be fair, if I'm thinking of young adult or middle grade series from when I was reading middle grade, I never finished the third Inkheart book because I got so stressed out about a character, to my understanding, death in book 2, that I just needed some space, knowing full well that maybe it wasn't the complete end. And I do think that there may be a return to Inkheart on the horizon that means I need to finish that series. Also, I realized, for anyone who's been yelling at me in their head about the history of this, I've been referring to this as Elizabethan, but we are within the court of James I, so Shakespearean would be more accurate. I tend to just default to Elizabethan, but that is not correct, so I apologize there. But if you like that era of historical fiction combined with a little bit of the fantastical or supernatural, I definitely think that you should pick up this series, because I for sure am having a lot of fun with it. Okay, next I did The Truth According to Ember by Danica Nava, which I did in a mix between audio and physical. I showed you, I think at some point, how I was listening to the audiobook, but my hold at the library did also come in, so I kind of switched between the two depending on my mood. And when I talked about this in my anticipated releases video for the month it came out, I indicated that there was a little bit of hesitance because, or I had a little bit of hesitance because I tend to get secondhand embarrassment really easily. And so when there is like the centralized conceit of an untruth or a lie, that can be hard for me. However, within the conception of this novel, it made sense to me because we have Ember, our protagonist, basically lying on her job application and saying she's white in order to increase her odds of getting a job. And she does get the job based on this, which is a critique on corporate culture and current hiring that is pretty well documented despite protections that are supposed to be in place. However, when Ember gets to this job, and it is a workplace romance, which is fun and also very stressful for me in the sense that I kind of contextualize it amidst, you know, being in a workplace and what the logistics of that even would be. And there's a lot of hiding the workplace romance in this, which compounds further lies. But also, Ember is just telling a lot of lies for seemingly no reason. And I know that she has a reason. And that's all that matters. But as a reader, it was really hard for me. One, it was hard for me to get on board with lies I didn't see the purpose of, and that Ember, from her point of view within the narrative, never really explains to me as a reader, even if it's just that oops and that kind of getting trapped in it, which I think was the intention, and then that was supposed to kind of exacerbate the kind of comedy of it. However, I don't really find those kinds of situations comedic, like that comedy of circumstance and the kind of accidental compounding lie, because instead I just get really stressed out with that. And when we got to the end and the romantic interest kind of threw at Ember that he didn't even really know her, I agreed with him. I was like, what is the thing that is gonna make him come back? Or why should I be rooting for him to come back when everything is kind of predicated on this lie for him? And so I was really bummed by that, because it really did steal some of the enjoyment for me. And I didn't end up loving it as much as I wanted to, especially knowing that this is the first Indigenous romance from a major publisher. And instead, Ember just kind of came off feeling a lot more juvenile than I think she was intended in terms of her point of view. And I think part of it too was the point of view, and that we were only in her point of view. There was no dual POV here. And I know I've been seeing a lot of discourse, by which I mean I've seen a couple of threads, and I feel like I'm going to have potentially a lot more opinions or conversations to be had about how I am feeling about threads at a later date, or maybe never, but about this idea of point of view preferences. And a lot of people are indicating a preference for a first person point of view, which I personally have come to kind of associate with contemporary romance anyway. When I do interact with it, it is very jarring for me in historical romance. I'm not gonna lie, having tried to read a historical romance recently where I encountered that, and then I was getting points of view from characters that weren't even the main couple. That's a side tangent. Anyway, I personally have generally preferred third person in romance, and I really enjoy having that kind of omnipresent eye, depending on the level of knowledge we're given as a reader. But I do find value in that and being able to kind of contextualize characters' behavior, because I don't believe that characters should have to behave good at all times, even in romance, where it feels even more important that we're rooting for a character. However, I think it's important that characters have room to mess up and to be redeemed in whatever way. But conflict, again, is the driver of narrative, and so there is a lot of importance in that. So it's a long, tangential, roundabout way of saying that I don't think that Ember should be constrained to how I think she should be behaving. But at the same time, I think that maybe if the point of view had given me a little bit more from her, I would have understood more in being able to kind of contextualize that. And I recognize that too, maybe I'm just not coming with the right perspective. I don't know, maybe I was just too stressed out about the workplace romance of it all, though I was really rooting for the romance. I thought it was really cute, so I really enjoyed that. And just kind of the exploration of the workplace politics, I did find really interesting and very true to life. And I also appreciated this kind of idea and romanticization almost of a very normal job, and just how appreciated a very normal job can be to a lot of people, or for a lot of people. Tenses aren't making sense there. But I think especially in contemporary romance, a lot of the kind of fantasy within the romance often is in the job and what kind of oversized life these characters get to live, and how we as a reader get to live that oversized life with them. But to see something that is very much relatable to a lot of people in relation to just basic 9-to-5 life and the tensions of that, the inner office politics, the way that certain people may try to take advantage of newer employees or less experienced employees, or employees that for whatever reason they just think that they can take advantage of, and having to navigate that. again, it was stressful. That is a stressful thing. And I'm not saying that particular piece was romanticized, but it was nice to see something that was just the everyday reflected and getting to heighten that and find the romance in the everyday. I did appreciate that piece of it. Just unfortunately, the book as a whole didn't end up working for me the way that I hoped. Next, I read Nicked by M.T. Anderson, which is one of the only books in recent memory that I have in fact talked about on a Feature Friday. I'm really trying to get back into Feature Fridays, especially as they're kind of what I started this channel to do. But at the same time, I'm going to talk books in a way that is organic, and I do want to have space to have informed thoughts and deeper thoughts about a title in order to talk about it in that more kind of extended format. So I don't know, let me know if you have thoughts on Feature Fridays, but I definitely have more thoughts in that video because honestly it feels kind of like it's been a lifetime since I read this book, and unfortunately this didn't land for me the way that I hoped and the way that I've seen it land for even other booktubers, because for me, the prose here, which was third person and had this kind of dark humor to it, it really was set up to be something that I really responded to, especially because M.T. Anderson is an author that goes back for me. Like, I read him in young adulthood. He has an extensive background in middle grade and young adult fiction, and I believe this is his first adult novel. And so I was very excited about this, especially because it was a medieval historical that had this touch of the odd in the sense that we were basically going on a heist to steal saints' bones. Unfortunately, the way that the prose ended up reading for me, it started out with that very kind of like humorous bend, and the humorous bend stays throughout. But what I thought was opaque at the beginning, I was correct, at least in my own reading experience, and stayed opaque, but I was expecting to kind of wade through that and come out to the other side, kind of understanding more about the language and the way the book was written, basically to kind of become acclimated to it, especially because the book itself was not very long. And maybe it was just my own state of mind while reading the book, but my brain always felt like it was fighting through the narrative, especially in terms of the characters that were being presented and who was who. And toward the end, my brain had really kind of finally figured it out, but by then we were done and it no longer mattered. And so I was a little disappointed because, again, I really wanted to like this book. There was a part of me that was like, maybe I'm just not smart enough for this book, which fair enough. But I wanted to love it so badly because it had all of the makings of a perfect book for me, especially with that historical setting that was also a commentary on the modern moment and this kind of irreverent, dark, in some ways, humor. So I by no means am telling you not to read this book because I do think that there is something there. I do think that there is something that I have potentially, more than potentially, missed there. I feel like I still am wanting very much to like this book, and ultimately I didn't in my reading experience. But I am holding out hope, and maybe you will have a different reading experience. But if you've read this book and have thoughts, I would be very interested to hear them. And then of the same era as M.T. Anderson, and in some ways an author that sits in the same space as M.T. Anderson for me in my reading life, we read Uglies by Scott Westerfeld, and you may or may not have joined me on that adventure. And then, of course, watching the movie, talking about it, them in tandem, that was an adventure in and of itself. The movie, I felt, was ultimately pretty disappointing, and I think also ultimately missed the mark on what the book was exploring and the opportunities to take what the book was exploring in the 2000s and update it to the kind of modern moment, especially, as I've said probably ad nauseum at this point, with the idea of influencer culture, because it feels just like an exacerbated form of what was being explored in this book. And in a lot of ways is the book coming to life and to fruition. And this by no means is a perfect book. There is a lot that really kind of roots it in early 2000s dystopia, and this is one of the first early 2000s dystopia. This is pre-Hunger Games. This was my first dystopia. And as someone, again, who doesn't, as I've said a lot, gravitate toward dystopias, it's very interesting to me because I have such a love of this book, or a memory of a love of this book and this series, though when kind of reintroducing myself to some of the plot points of the rest of the series and trying to kind of contextualize some of the changes in the show and how that would impact things down the line in terms of the narrative, I had definitely forgotten things. But a lot of this and the images, the mental images, did stay with me in terms of like the hoverboards in particular, which I would argue also does really root it in the 2000s and the prevalence of skateboarding. But this book also held up a lot better than I thought it was going to in a lot of ways as well, is what I was trying to get at and finally got to. And I do present the caveat that a lot of that may be nostalgia. Absolutely. But I do think that there is something here, and I think that there is a lot of subtext here. Even when the text isn't as subtle as it thinks it is, there are things being explored here that I think the movie removed a lot of that subtext and kind of the larger considerations. It didn't trust the audience with that in the way that the book does. And so, I don't know, I'm really glad I did reread this because it was a trip down memory lane and there was a lot of good here that I enjoyed. And I enjoyed getting to see Tally again, getting to see David again. And part of me is like, should I reread the rest of the series? I don't know. But yeah, I would argue, again, if you are going into this book for the first time, recognize it for what it is. But I think if you read this when you were a teenager like I did, I think there's going to be a lot nostalgic here, and that is part of the reason it is such a bummer that the movie didn't deliver in the way that I hoped. However, at the same time, again, I am a millennial. I am used to being disappointed by adaptations of beloved books, especially books that I have waited decades to see on screen. I'm looking at you, Artemis Fowl, and no, I have not forgotten. And no, I will not let it go. And then I read My Dirty Duke by Joanna Shupe on Kindle. I decided to toy or play with the idea of Kindle Unlimited. I got it in my head because I was seeing a lot of authors that I know and love added to KU, and I was like, oh, maybe this is another way that I could support them while also exploring this thing that has blown up so much that I feel left behind in a lot of discussions. However, at the same time, I recognize my habits as a reader, and I don't know if this will slot in to my reading life as seamlessly because I already have kind of my set ways, so to speak, in terms of how I kind of maneuver between library books and the books I buy, which is not a perfect system because things just shuffle down the pile, but my pile is large at this point. However, my thought also is that I like to think of like bed books, or I have been playing with the idea of bed books a lot, in that maybe I'm sometimes reading in multiple formats. Always I'm reading in multiple formats, but having something on my Kindle or something a little lighter potentially to read right before bed. Historically, that was like fan fiction time, but I haven't been really reading fan fiction as much, and instead it felt like that time was taken or given to doom scrolling, which is not the best use of that time. So it feels like I could be exploring new authors or just having access to authors I already know I enjoy and books I have not yet read with that time. And this is me starting out with an author I know I love, Joanna Shupe, but this is a novella and the tone is much different in some ways than the books I am used to out of Avon. So this is a little darker, a little spicier in some ways. It was interesting because in the last book out of Avon that I read from her, the one with the Duke, I can't remember the full name right now. Maybe I'll throw it up. But there was a lot of talk in that book between the romantic leads about being a little bit more adventurous in certain pursuits and expecting that to lead to spicier scenes. And I didn't really know that I needed that necessarily, but that's what I was expecting based on this information the characters had given me as a reader about themselves. And in retrospect, or at the time even, to be completely honest, it felt a little tamer than was being set up. And here we have the opportunity to kind of push a little further. Now, I will admit, this conceit was a little outside of my comfort zone going in, but I trust Joanna Shupe, and it was, well, it wasn't free because I was paying for the subscription. But the conceit is that our fully adult female protagonist has a crush on her father's friend who is a duke, and has had for a long time. And he does not know this. There has never been anything inappropriate there. And in fact, since her coming out, he has really distanced himself from her in particular. And so she basically goes chasing after him, and she is caught watching a garden liaison, and things go from there. And so that is much spicier than before. I will say there are still some Joanna Shupe hallmarks here in that our protagonist is a photographer. Our protagonists, especially the women in Joanna Shupe novels, at least to my reading experience so far, and I'm reading another one from her in KU right now that follows the same model, generally have either a profession or a hobby that really sets them apart within their historical context, because most of her books are set within predominantly the Gilded Age in America. I do believe this one was more Regency, Victorian Regency. I'm trying to remember the history of cameras to be able to place it, and I unfortunately cannot. But it wasn't Gilded Age as much because of the Duke. Nevertheless, it still has some of those hallmarks. So even as it was kind of pushing me as a reader, even as someone who has been reading romance for decades, and I'm not implying it was like super outside the box or super spicy by any means, but it was bordering on taboo. And so there were still those things for me to cling on to as a reader. And I have started reading the first in one of her only series I have not read that is available through KU as well. So hopefully I will have more to report back on in the October wrap up on that one. But this was a novella, so it was a little shorter, a lot shorter, but it was a nice, pleasant little jaunt. It was me dipping my toes into the world of KU a little bit more actively. And so I'm definitely still exploring. If you have recommendations, let me know. Again, I can't promise when or if I'm going to get to something. I know that someone has recommended in the past Zodiac Academy, which I believe is on KU. I don't know. There are a lot of books to read. I'm playing around. Lastly, for October, I read Malort, The Redemption of a Revered and Reviled Spirit by Josh Noel, and I actually just finished the first rough edit, very rough, and I will explain why here in a second, of a video all about this book, or essentially me and my friend Dana hanging out, drinking Malort, and talking about this book. Now, in the drinking Malort portion of this discussion, neither of us could see the viewfinder of the camera. And there is a lot of discussion, a lot of talk, a lot of brouhaha about YouTubers and looking at themselves in the camera. But I'm here to tell you, when you don't, you miss that putting the bottle of Malort centered between the two of you puts it in focus and takes you out of focus. And so the video kind of devolves into pure chaos, especially as we are drinking Malort throughout the entire video. But all of that to say is it's a little rawer, it's a little rougher, like Malort itself, but that is on the horizon for you. So keep your eye out, because I'm hoping to have that up sooner rather than later. But again, it is all about Malort. And if you're not from Chicago, you might be going, huh? And Malort is an infamous Chicago liqueur that is often used as almost a hazing ritual as a transplant. And that is part of the discussion that Dana and I have, is this conception of Malort, her as a local, me as a transplant, and me kind of moving to the city as the renaissance of Malort really was at its peak. And so this book is out of, it's not University of Chicago, it's Chicago Review Press, and really traces the history of malort. And that sounds interesting because malort is such an interesting kind of piece of Chicago and culture, and it's an icebreaker in a lot of ways. It's a way into conversation, but at the same time, I had no clue what I was really walking into with this book. Like, was it going to be dry local history, or was it really going to capture the essence of the liquor that has such iconic, really, marketing at this point? And I am pleased to report that it was the latter, and I was very pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed this book. It is like, what, 200 something pages? It's got a lot of pictures and references, but it is very interesting. It's fun. It is an exploration of the city, but also this liquor and the people, and I thought it was a lot of fun, especially as it was peppered by the kind of image of this liquor that is presented, especially today. You'll see the malort trucks driving around with things like "do not drink responsibly," and just what the story of this is and how uniquely Chicago it feels, even as malort is gaining a more national and international presence. And I think that this book is part of that, especially as I had this pre-ordered. I pre-ordered a copy for me and Dana in preparation, or hopes of preparation, for that video, and I waited like a week past publication to even get my pre-order in because there was such a demand for this book. Now, to be fair, I am directly in the target market demographic for this book, but nonetheless, and demographic may not even be the case because I spent 10 years, essentially, almost 10 years I went in the city before having my first shot of malort, which I just had in February, because I accidentally let Dana know I had not had malort. And so I wasn't really part of the kind of group of people that really created an identity around malort. But at the same time, malort still feels like this icon of the Chicago identity. And I am pleased to report that I may have developing ideas about the liqueur itself and how I feel about malort as a drink, but by those kind of standards of just back in February, I wouldn't think of myself as the kind of target demographic for this book. I would think of it for like the malort fanboys and fangirls who are very much into malort, and that was never my thing. But I really, really enjoyed this book. I liked the history of it. I liked the way that it situated malort, again, amidst the larger picture and the larger story. So we really zoomed in on the people associated with it and kind of getting to pull back the curtain and see behind into what was going on behind a lot of this kind of iconic marketing, especially for good or for ill at some points. There were some periods I clearly missed upon reading the book, but again, we'll talk about it a little bit more in that video. We talk about a lot, but we also drink a decent amount of malort, so I don't want to overpromise, but again, tune in to find out just how much malort we do drink in that video. But yeah, so I guess, especially considering I was leading up to an international vacation in the month of September and really trying to get things together, I think all around September was still a pretty decent reading month. Again, I also just think that this year has felt really odd to me for some reason, and I can't really put my finger on it. I'm interested to know how you've been feeling about your reading year, if it feels different, if it's all just me, which it probably is because we all go through our kinds of peaks and valleys in our own reading lives. But that is what I read in September. We will find our way back to the normalcy, hopefully, on this channel very soon. But thank you for tuning in and being interested in what I read. I would love to hear what you read in September, though it is a while away at this point. But as always, like and subscribe if you feel like it, read something good, and yeah,